Hi everyone, and welcome to the last lecture of this semester. And I was unable, unfortunately, to get my screen recorder to work, so my last PowerPoint is a little bit moot, although you can see some of the slides, although not the videos I was going to show you if you look in the PowerPoint slides on Canvas. But I just wanted to talk a little bit at the end of the semester about what it is, I think, to look at the ancient world and see not only a period in history, but also something that has been reinterpreted and looked at by so many different generations and so many different people from different areas throughout the intervening, 2,000 years, give or take a couple millennia, since they were alive. And I think it's a really wonderful thing to have this period in history that is so flexible, that gives us these kind of icons of history, people like Cleopatra, who you can reimagine almost any way you want. And part of the reason that she has been used by everyone from, starlets in the 1800s up through Liz Taylor in the 60s to um, cross dressers in the 60s in New York City. You can see a photo of one of those in our Canvas PowerPoint as well, and beyond, right up to pop stars, both Katy Perry and Rihanna, Beyonce. They've all, drawn on this kind of Egyptian queen iconography as a way of showing, creating a self-identity for themselves, right? And in some cases, with cultural appropriation and things like that, it can become thorny and difficult. But the reason that so many people draw on Cleopatra, I think, is because she does kind of exist as a historical figure at the intersection of so many cultures. So we have the African and Egyptian side, we have her Ptolemaic and Hellenistic side, we have her interactions with the Roman world. So she really does kind of cover all these bases and invite reinterpretation from so many different angles. And that's a really powerful tool for people to be able to use. So I think one of the things that is most wonderful about the ancient world is its ability to serve people in the present day as a space of exploration, as something that they can use to kind of look back on and understand their own roles in contemporary society and to reinterpret what they see about the ancient world through a lens of whatever is going on now. And then there are also cases where we have multiple layers upon layers that are extra fascinating. So if you look, for example, at the works of Toni Morrison, right? So she wrote a novel called Beloved that is very famous. And that is a story that tells it tells the story of a former slave, a woman, and her kind of struggles with dealing with the past. And I don't want to spoil it or anything, so I'm trying not to give anything away. Um, but it draws upon, and this might be a bit of a spoiler in and of itself, it draws upon the structure of the framework of the myth of Medea after Jason and the Argonauts, which is one of my sort of favorite, most interesting stories from the ancient world. And so we have someone who is writing in the late 20th century, looking back towards a story that is set in the mid-late 1800s, and then also using as a sort of kernel of structure and framework to tell that story something that is from the ancient world, from the mythological sphere. And we see that kind of interpretation all the time. If you've heard of Chirac, the Spike Lee movie that kind of tells a story of Chicago in the 1970s through the lens of the Lysistrata, the play by Aristophanes, in which women withhold sex to stop a war. So using these classical stories and updating them and playing with them in new ways, it kind of operates very much like Shakespeare in that way, that you can look at it through multiple lenses and play with its stories and see how they apply in different cultural frameworks. Shakespeare is also interesting because he himself took so much from the ancient world. So if you have ever heard of his play Comedy of Errors, it's not one of the more popular ones. It is almost a copy, a direct copy of an ancient Roman play by the playwright Plautus called The Menechmi, and both of them are very complicated tales of mistaken identity based on slaves or servants, and I think Shakespeare's their servants. The ancient Roman one, they are slaves who are twins, and masters who are twins who are separated at birth. So it is, just a total absurd comedy about these figures that Shakespeare then updates, turns into one of his plays. That's very difficult to stage because you need two twins who are at least convincingly enough alike to be mistaken for one another. So there are lots of ways in which we can play with the classical world and use it not just as a topic of study in and of itself, but also to look at the way in which it has been interpreted throughout societies for good and for bad, as we've seen in the past lectures. And I think it's a wonderful topic in that sense, because we can also continue to build on that. And because the past is to some degree inaccessible to us, I think it gives you a degree of license to actually mess around with it. You're not going to hurt anybody by reinterpreting the story of Cleopatra. So we have a place in which we can play around with the past, reinterpret the past, play out scenarios that we can think about our present society through looking at the past, and then just also enjoying something that is displaced enough from us to actually just take a little bit of an escapist fantasy and go there. So if we look at, say, the Swords and Sandals flicks of the 1950s and 60s, they're wonderful. They're goofy and hokey, and they tell a lot of stories about, say, Hercules. Jason and the Argonauts is one of the greatest films of all time, with its fantastic stop-motion skeleton fight that you should definitely look up and watch. So we have these classical stories also being, just like we saw with our artists, a place where you can kind of play with new technologies to show fantastical elements, to play with mythological scenes. We also see that, for example, with newer entrants into this category like 300 or the TV series Spartacus, that take on this comic book aesthetic and apply it and kind of combine it with the ancient world to make a blood and gutsified version that is really exaggerated in those aspects of the ancient world that are most kind of fascinating to us because they are so different from the way that we live now, like gladiators. And then we also have the ancient world nowadays. If we look at, say, my highest recommendation possible, which is HBO's television series Rome, which tells the story of the sort of transition from republic to empire, following parallel storylines of the sort of political elites like the Caesars and Pompeys and Attila of the Julii, who is, at least in the world of HBO Rome, one of the most iconic women of all time. And then we also see the sort of lives of these legionary soldiers that they live. So we see the sort of lower middle class type of Roman life as well, playing out in parallel to one another. So it's a really wonderful show in that they are fascinated with kind of historical realism and gritty detail, which is not to say that everything is like exactly authentic, right? There's this interesting balance between authenticity and storytelling, using non-authentic things to kind of exaggerate the pieces of the story that you want to. And I think HBO Rome is really wonderful in that it captures our contemporary artistic idiom of this love of gritty realism, love of looking at the dirt and the grime and the sweat, and playing out the kind of very realness, hyper reality of these old stories in particular, but also new ones. And then it also has it shows our sort of contemporary interest in capturing the voices of both elites and non-elites, right? We're still fascinated by characters like Cleopatra and Caesar, by our historical icons, but we also contemporarily, we have this interest in hearing from the little guy, hearing from the average everyday person. So I think that looking at the way in which the classical world shows up in pop culture can be really revealing about the sort of values of the society at that time because of how flexible it is. So it's a really fascinating window onto the way in which people are thinking about what is important in a society, what is strange in a society, what is taboo. And as you guys discussed with our forged erotic lamps in the past, right? What are the taboo things that we see showing up of interest to people in different time periods? So the classical world, I would just really highly recommend that you all check out some of the media, whether it's reading a Toni Morrison book or Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man, which draws upon a lot of pieces of the Odyssey while also telling a story of early 20th century Black America. It's unbelievably it's a difficult read, and it is unbelievably good. Or if you want to watch Hercules with The Rock, which is one of these self-consciously stupid action films. I think, I don't think that's an insult to call it that. But it also simultaneously is kind of a weird meditation on the technology of storytelling, and on the ways in which historical figures can spin out into mythological figures through the transmission of storytelling. So it's kind of a great mixture of the sort of theoretical thinking and also just like ridiculous action and crass humor. So I would really recommend that you, if you are in quarantine and need things to do, watch some ancient Rome and ancient Greek themed media, consume it and see what you see, because I think it can tell you a lot about the societies that are producing that media in themselves, not just the ancient world. Especially the more you know about the ancient world, the more you can learn, through the sort of departures from what we see in the art historical realm of scholarship, and what we see in pop culture. So highly recommend lots of pop culture. Check out the hairstyles. That is, I think, the number one way to typologically and stylistically date a response to the classical world is the way in which they interpret hairstyles. For some reason, always looks just like hairstyles of the period in which a piece is made. I personally think that's fascinating. So closing, I just want to say thank you all for bearing with me this semester as I kind of struggled to get online and get this class continuing. Before that, I really enjoyed meeting with you in person, as you know, and I am going to miss teaching this class. I'm sorry that I feel like I've done the topic a little bit of a disservice by through my online lectures, which is not my favorite medium to work in, but I really appreciate you sticking with it, and I'm looking forward to seeing your final assignments and hearing your responses to what this experience of, looking at the art of the ancient world and thinking about how it applies today, what it means to you as people who exist in a very strange time period ourselves. So very much, and I hope to see you all again in the future at some point. Have a wonderful rest of the semester and summer break.